Hello, and a very warm welcome to all of you who've logged into our webinar today. I'm Colin Dennis. I'm Chairman of the Safety and Reliability Society Webinar Working Group, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to our event. We had a webinar on the lessons learned from 10 years of using the CSMRA on the 28th of April, and it was a very popular event. We had over 500 people trying to access the webinar on that day, and because we had such a great deal of interest in it, we had many questions that were raised, and we were only able to actually get through 5 questions during the Q&A session. So because of this, and because of the level of interest that there obviously is in the subject matter, we decided that another event would be useful to put on for you. So the 3 presenters who presented on the 28th of April have kindly agreed to join us for another panel stroke Q&A session, and being able to take your questions. We also noted that at the time during that particular session, we didn't have a representative from the assessment body community, and I'm very pleased to be able to say that we have Carolyn Salmon from Ricardo Certification, who's going to join us on our panel today to be able to take questions on from an assessment body perspective. So, what's the program for today's event? I'm doing my bit of introduction, and then we've got a couple of presentations just to get us started. Dragan Jovocic is going to give us the summary of the key points from the webinar on the 28th of April. That should just be a few minutes. And then because we didn't have representation from the assessment body fraternity on the 28th, Carolyn is going to give us some thoughts on the key lessons learned from 10 years of independent assessment in the context of the CSMRA. And then we're going to have the main Q&A panel sessions. This will be for about 75 minutes, something like that. And to put a bit of structure on it, we'll split it up into 5 sections, and I'll introduce those sections to you as we come along. Then, as we get towards the end of the event, we'll have a summary of in terms of the key points to think about going forward, things that we've picked up from the previous event, and what we will hear during the Q&A today. I'll then give you a bit of a briefing on the accessing the webinar recording and the slides, and then initiate a feedback form to close the event. What I would just like to mention is the fact that following the last event, I think it's important that we do make the slides and recording available publicly, and it's going to be on the European Rail Agency website as well as the SARS website. So just to alert you to the fact that it is the intention to make this recording publicly available, and that will be the video, the audio, the chat. So everything you see on screen, including the people's names, will appear on the final recording. So just so you're aware of that when you are asking your questions, that the text will be on the recording, and I hope that's okay, and it'll give the opportunity to more people to participate in viewing this particular webinar. So all of you, I think, joined the event last time, and so I won't bore you with too much of the details of how to use Click Meeting, other than to note that since the last event on the 28th of April, they've actually changed the way in which the question icon, the Ask Question icon, appears. If you look down in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen where the Type Your Message line is, the Ask Question icon has moved over to just to the right of that, and it's you click it once to go turn it blue, when you can then ask a question, and that'll come up as a formal question that I can pose to the panel members. If you click it again, it goes off blue back to white again, and just use that as the right message icon to put any messages in that other than that isn't a specific question which is a point of interest, or you can't hear, or some such for that. So so that's the overall process for asking questions. And so if you type your questions, you can type them any time, and I will try and prioritize them for in the sections of the Q&A that where that would be relevant. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the first few short presentations. But before I do that, I'd just like to introduce our 4 panel members for today. I will just mention the fact that we've got Pete Gracie, who's Head of Interoperability and Rail Vehicle Engineering at the Office of Road and Rail in the UK. Pete is a former Royal Navy submarine weapons engineer officer. Pete has over 17 years experience in the rail safety, signal engineering and interoperability. His railway career has included project delivery for Network Rail, Bechtel and Crossrail. He was the systems engineering manager for Docklands Light Railway during extensive preparations for the London 2012 Olympics, and the senior assessment body stroke notified body signatory for the Network Certification body. He took up his current role in the Office of Rail and Road in early 2020. And we have Ivan Lucic. Ivan is the Eastern Region Systems Engineer and Chair of the Safety Review Panel Infrastructure Projects at Network Rail. Ivan works on delivery-focused system integration and assurance solutions on some of the most complex railway projects in the UK. His railways career includes numerous senior roles within the rail industry. Most recently, in 2018, he became the Engineering Systems Director in Network Rail Infrastructure Projects, and later the Chair of Eastern Region Safety Review Panel. Dragan Jovicic is the Safety and Operations Unit Project Officer at the European Rail Agency. Dragan has more than 25 years experience in the rail sector. Before joining the ERA in 2006, he worked for the rail industry in the Control Command branch of Alstom for 13 years. He was Project Safety and Assurance Manager in charge of RAMS activities and the production of safety cases in line with the requirements of the Senelec 50126, 8 and 9. At the ERA, Dragan has taken part in the writing of the CSMRA and the revised Regulation 352/2009. And our new panelist for today is Carolyn Salmon. Carolyn is appointed lead assessment body to AsBo to Ricardo Certification, responsible for ensuring AsBo services delivered by Ricardo Certification are in line with the regulation. She has delivered a diverse range of AsBo services for the rail industry since 2016, including leading the AsBo services for electrification and infrastructure upgrades for the route from Maidenhead to Cardiff, and is currently supporting the Crossrail programme, assessing the safety arguments for interfaces, as well as the development of the rulebook. Carolyn supports a wide number of AsBo projects across Europe, including Denmark, Spain and the Netherlands, and has in the past provided independent assessment for the rail industry across the globe and for many other industry sectors. So those are the 4 panelists, and I'd now like to invite Dragan to give the short summary of the lessons learned from the last webinar we had on the 28th of April.
I hope you hear me. Not the same as last time. I had a few problems. So in April, if you remember, we had the background context and the challenges with the opening of the railway market explained, the initial objectives of the CSM for risk assessment, and then Ivan explained his experience and the experience of Network Rail with the CSM. Pete explained also his experience, and if you remember, Pete occupied different, it was just reminded by Colin, different posts as applicant, as assessment body, and now as safety authority. So he explained his experience, and at the end of the webinar, I presented the feedback that we have collected with the survey that we have done. So what do we have to keep in mind is that I have highlighted the main information. The railway market opening has divided the former and vertically integrated companies into many new players, and each one is given assigned specific roles. Consequently, with the opening, we don't have anymore a single railway actor who has an overall view and understanding of the architecture and the arrangements in place for managing the safety of the railway system. So in order to ensure that the risks are across interfaces between all those actors are well controlled, identified, understood, and controlled, we have it is crucial to have cooperation between those actors. The CSM for risk assessment has introduced a new mindset for a systematic management of the railway safety. So instead of the historical way of approaching safety, or react and fix, the CSM is a proactive risk-based approach, which aims at anticipating what can go wrong and then to avoid it or to try to mitigate, reduce the frequency or the severity of the consequences. So the CSM is a harmonized approach which defines a minimum process for what shall be done, but as it doesn't constrain any practice or method on how to implement it, it leaves freedom to the proposers to use the guidance material either from ERA or from existing standards on how to demonstrate the compliance with the high-level requirements contained in the CSM. So in practice, the CSM does not request anything new the railways shouldn't be already doing. And this was clearly emphasized last time by Pete, based on his experience with the CSM at the different posts he occupied. The independent assessment body involvement from the very beginning of the project is something which is necessary to permit the mutual recognition of the results from the risk assessment. And therefore, the process, the proposers shall work together with the assessment bodies instead of perceiving them as a kind of Trojan horses. The AsBos are friends of the applicants who are there to help in order to secure the risk assessments. 10 to 15, only 10 to 15%, these are average figures, of course, of stakeholders across the European Union have a good experience with the method, which demonstrates that the method is effective in reaching the initial goals of the method. However, a large majority of other stakeholders still have difficulties with the understanding and with the pragmatic implementation of the method. So for them, for this category of actors, the CSM is still heavy paperwork, which with difficulties. So consequently, because of those difficulties, the sector is reluctant in using the method because of fears of heavy administrative burden that increases not only the cost, but also increases the delays. This is the perception the sector has. Thereby, the concept of the significant change is often intentionally misused just to avoid the formal application of the process in the annex of the CSM, and especially to avoid the mandatory appointment of an independent assessment body. So the coverage rate that we have collected through the survey concerning how many changes are significant, it's between 2 and 3%, but certainly in average, not higher than 5%. And those are mainly technical changes where the experience is much better than with the management using the method of operational and organizational changes. So many actors also wrongly interpret and understand non-significant change means a right to do nothing, which is, of course, as I explained last time, not the case. And finally, what we have explained is that there is a high need for an intensive education throughout the sector across the EU, and appropriate training with illustrative examples in order to demystify the methodology and to increase the sector awareness about risk and the need for building a real safety culture, which includes a proper control of all risks, but also of risks arising from the variability of human performance and from human and organizational factors which are involved in all phases of the life cycle of the railway system. So this is a summary of the key points from the last seminar. I give you the floor.
Excellent. Thanks, Dragan, for summarising that for us. And now I'd like to invite Carolyn to join us to give us a few thoughts on from an assessment body perspective before we get into the Q&A. Carolyn.
Okay, can you hear me? I'm trying to, sorry, I'm just...
We can hear you.
Okay, I'm trying to move my, it won't seem to move the slide on for me. Okay, right, okay, got it. Right, thank you. So, yes, thank you, Colin. As Colin introduced me, I'm Carolyn Salmon from Ricardo Certification, and I'm the lead assessment body at Ricardo Certification. So CSM, personally, I'm a great supporter of CSM. I think it offers the UK rail industry an opportunity to build on the principles that we've adopted for many years in the UK, but takes it a step further for us, and it provides a pragmatic risk management process for a mature rail industry. So going back a number of years, when safety engineering first evolved as a discipline, we had to use first principles. We had to do explicit risk estimation type activities to be able to understand what risks we were encountering and how we needed to be able to manage them. As a result, we in the UK developed the Yellow Book and had a 7-step process, which was what Ivan covered in the first in the seminar, going through in a lot of detail and a lot of good detail exactly how we should go about identifying our hazards, identifying causes and consequences, looking at risks associated with hazards, what options we had for reducing the risk, and then evaluating which options to work out which residual level of risk we had and whether or not that was acceptable. But over the years, and especially in the UK, we've developed a lot of standards, a lot of processes, procedures, practices, equipment that builds on our experience, builds on good engineering judgment. That means we don't have to keep going back to those first principles. And so I think CSM is really good in that it offers us that opportunity to take advantage of what we've done well in the past. So we don't have to keep asking ourselves how hazards could arise, how they should be mitigated. We simply follow the very good processes, but we do have to demonstrate we follow those, and we need to make sure that we follow them properly, of course. So CSM is explicitly allowing us to say, I've done this before and I know what I'm dealing with, so that when we encounter areas where we haven't done it before, when we've got uncertainty and novelty, we can really focus our time and energy on those key areas. And when we do that, we can go back to the first principles. The 7-step process of the Yellow Book still is very much applicable today. So it's not really introducing anything new into our rail industry. We've been doing this for a number of years and we should carry on doing it. But what we are doing is we're allowing us to say where we don't have to go back to those first principles, there are alternative ways that we can manage our risk, and we focus really on the levels of uncertainty and novelty. So on that basis, given that we are a mature rail industry in the UK, I think CSM process is excellent for us. We can use those codes of practice, we can use those products and systems that we've learned a lot from in the past and make good use of them. Dragan said that there is a perception that CSM introduces bureaucracy. It is true. You have to put you have to write a lot of stuff down when you're following a CSM process. You've got to document every step. You've got to justify why you're doing what you're doing. And yes, that introduces perhaps additional level of activities that you haven't done in the past. But that's what we should be doing. We should be writing down and justifying how we're managing our hazards. We shouldn't just assume that because there's a process in place or there's a standard or a system that exists, that provides us adequate mitigation. We need to think about, well, which hazards we're managing, and that they are the right measures that we need to take to manage those hazards. So we have to write that down. However, I do think if you follow the CSM process well and carefully in your first application, you should have set yourself up well, that when you come to do this again and again and again, you've got a good foundation, and that level of bureaucracy will be significantly reduced because you've got a good starting point. So in terms of acting as the AsBo and what you should do, some of these points Dragon mentioned. Obviously, you have to appoint an AsBo if the change that you're putting into service is a significant change, and that's a legal obligation of the regulation. So you have to appoint an AsBo. Dragon said it, and I'm going to repeat it because I really do think it's worthwhile remembering this, that if your change is not significant, it doesn't mean that you don't have to do anything. You have to follow a safety management process. You just don't have to legally follow the safety management process that's defined in the CSM regulation. But the CSM regulation provides a good process. So even if it's not significant, it's still sensible to follow it, which is what Network Rail have adopted. And the difference there is you don't have to legally appoint an AsBo. But again, it's up to you. Maybe it's sensible to do so. But if you have got a significant change, then you do need to follow CSM and you do need to appoint an AsBo. And again, I'm going to repeat what Dragon said, your AsBo is your friend, not your enemy. Ultimately, we have the same goal as you. We want to have a safe railway. I know there's a perception that we're a necessary evil, that projects have to sort of tolerate us. And therefore, there's a view that perhaps if you keep us at arm's length, it's better for the project. Maybe we'll interfere less with the project. But that's not the case. We actually should be able to add value to your projects. We can act as your conscience. We can give you the confidence that you've gone about the risk assessment process in the right way. And that when you get to the commissioning stage, what you want from us is you want us to support you in making that step. So that when you get to that stage, you'll be able to discharge your legal obligation and you'll be able to sleep at night knowing that you've delivered a safe railway because you've got us to help you get there. So obviously to do that, you need to engage with us at the earliest possible stage in the programme. As soon as you've made that decision that your change is significant, appoint your AsBo and get them involved. Just like when you're doing risk management, you need to do that from the start because the impact of trying to make changes late on when you realise that there's risks that you haven't managed. It's the same with an AsBo. Get us from the start. We come along the journey with you. You explain your approach to risk management and we can then buy into that approach. So when you get to the end, we'll be in a much better position to be able to provide you the support you need to go through to commissioning. Formally, what the AsBo does is there's two parts to what we do. We check for application of the process and we check the results of the application of the process. It is not a tick box exercise. Again, I know there's a misconception out there that we just go through and we check that there's requirements in CSM and we just check that you're carrying out those requirements. That's not the case. Just because you've got a safety plan in place or just because you've got a hazard record in place is not enough. We need to know that that hazard record is being populated with the right sort of hazards and with the right evidence that those hazards have been mitigated. So there is a view that an AsBo carries out a bit of a higher level of assessment, say typically compared with an independent safety assessor, as might be defined from the CEng standards. This is a wrong view. There's not meant to be a difference between the approach taken by an AsBo and the approach taken by an ISA. We will, just like an ISA, we will look at the results of the application of the process. Just like an ISA, we won't do 100% check. So it's still the proposer's responsibility to declare that the change they're making is safe in accordance with Article 6 of the regulation. But what we will do is provide an engineering judgment as to whether or not we think that declaration can be supported. So in doing that selective review, we'll pick elements of your project and we'll do deep dive analysis on those elements. So typically, we will focus on any areas of uncertainty. So if you've had to go down the explicit risk estimation route, we will focus on those areas and we will look to make sure that your risk assessments are robust and can support an argument that your residual level of risk in your system is acceptable. We won't just look at those areas though. We will also look at how you've used the other risk acceptance principles, those of the application of a code of practice and a reference system, and we'll make sure that you're using those appropriately too. So we will select some of those and we will have a look and check that we confirm that we think you've used them in the right way. So we will do that detailed deep dive assessment just like an ISA will do, and we will be looking for really robust evidence that you've applied the process in a sufficiently robust manner. So there isn't any difference in terms of the methodology that an ISA and an AsBo is undertaking. You should expect your AsBo to be equally as vigilant as an ISA has been in the past. To be honest, the real difference between one is slightly one of nomenclature. It's just a different term for the same sort of person. And in the process against which they're checking compliance. So an AsBo is checking compliance against CSM, and ISA is checking compliance against the CEng standards. But they're still doing the same thing. They're checking for compliance against a standard or, in the case of CSM, a regulation. There is also a slight difference, which I think we'll talk about perhaps a bit more later, is that an AsBo is formally accredited to do the role, to undertake the role of an AsBo. An ISA isn't typically formally accredited. So an AsBo actually is inspected by someone to formally hold an accreditation to act in the capacity of an AsBo. So that's an extra requisite in terms of acting as an assessment body. So some of the recommendations that I would have from acting as an AsBo: use what CSM is providing us with. So it's giving us a pragmatic approach to carrying out risk management. Make good use of what we have in this industry. Make good use of those codes of practice and the reference systems. So don't keep going back and starting from scratch. We do largely know what our hazards are. As I keep saying, we are a mature rail industry in the UK, and we've built lots of codes of practice and reference systems based on our experience from many, many years, thinking about engineering way before safety engineering even existed as a discipline. So make good use of them, but do use them with care. So don't just assume that the application of a code of practice is going to mitigate your hazard. Think about it. Always apply some thought. Is there something different I am doing? Am I using a code of practice in a slightly different way? Is there a reference system I'm using in a different application? Is there something slightly different to the norm about what I'm doing? And those are the cases where you want to focus and put your energies in terms of doing explicit risk estimation. The hazard record is a key document, and I think we need to be managing those carefully. Don't put everything in your hazard record. So don't put every last cause of every single hazard within your hazard record. And certainly, excuse me, you don't want to be doing that if you are using a code of practice or a reference system. So certainly the whole point is to say how we're managing certain hazards using existing knowledge and focusing on those areas which are presenting some difficulties and challenges to us. And if you put too much information in your hazard record and it's overpopulated, you'll really find it really difficult to manage. And particularly, I found this is an issue as you come towards the end of a programme. So there's a lot of good work put in up front at identifying hazards and creating a hazard record and beginning to populate it with safety requirements to mitigate hazards. What happens is it becomes difficult as you end up towards the commissioning phase. There's a lot of focus on the engineering and you've got the commissioning deadline looming. And so there's a lot of energy in doing the work on the ground and less energy in making sure that the hazard record is robust and captures your evidence that you have mitigated your hazards. So make sure that you manage that hazard record well, that you get it at the right level and that you populate it with the right amount of evidence. And then that way it supports you in terms of making that statement at the end that you have a safe system. So I would say it's worth taking the effort to make sure you put a well-structured hazard record together for your first project. It'll be time well spent. And then that hazard record could potentially become a generic template for future projects. Again, use with caution. Don't use it as an excuse to stop thinking, but it'll give you that good foundation for future projects. And of course, the last thing is going back to my role as an AsBo, work collaboratively with the AsBo throughout your project. Always be open and honest with us about what you're facing. We can be your friend. We cannot tell you what the answer is. We have to be independent, but we can provide a sounding board for you. You can openly debate what options you've got, and we can pass an independent view on the options you've got. We want to engage with you at the earliest opportunities so that we can be confident in the options you choose to implement, in the approach you're taking to risk management. If you just present us with a risk assessment towards the end of the project, we're going to have to raise lots of questions because we haven't been there as you've gone through the process. We're just coming in at the end and presented with an answer. So we'll end up asking you lots of questions at a very difficult time in your project when you're right up against it and you're ready to deliver. So if you've had us involved, you've involved us in some of the analysis activities that you've been undertaken, we've been part of that process, we'll understand the options you've selected, we'll understand the thinking you've gone through, and therefore we'll be more in a much better position to support you as you get towards that end of the project. Do allow enough time for us to complete our work though. Don't think that you could submit documentation, final documentation to us 2 or 3 weeks before commissioning and expect us to be able to carry out our review and provide you feedback in time. So include us in your programme. Put actual time in to make sure that everybody involved in the programme understands that the assessment body needs to carry out an activity and they need time to do that well. So include us explicitly in your plans, and then we can make sure that we put enough time and effort in to do our review appropriately. If you do that, hopefully we'll be able to be in a much better position to provide you with the positive support you need as you head towards commissioning and revenue service. And obviously, ultimately, as I said at the beginning, we're in this together. We all want a safe railway. So we want to be able to be in a position that we can actually support you in that way. Okay.
Thanks, Carolyn, for going through that perspectives from the assessment body, and it sort of completes the presentation cycle that we had from the previous webinar. What I'd now like to do is move on to the Q&A sections. Hopefully all of you saw the email I sent out yesterday, which had the agenda in it. What we're going to try and do is structure the questions into some groups, and starting off with assessing significant changes, including additionality. We've got a couple of questions that have come in on that already, I'm just going to invite Ivan to say a few words about this section of the Q&A. Oh. Sorry, Ivan, are you there?
I am now. Sorry,
okay.
I started updating suddenly at the same time. So basically, last time we had a discussion a little bit about the experience of assessing the significant changes and coming to conclusion what is significant, what is not significant, and I have made a particular comment on actually what do we mean by additionality, because as a concept, I do understand it as a systems engineer, but actually in terms of decision making and the time window within which it applies, it's a very difficult concept, and it's especially difficult to map it across to the railway organization between the sponsorship, the project, the asset management part of the Network Rail, and I guess most of the other railway companies in Europe are very similarly structured. So when we had a discussion about it, I've also mentioned that in Network Rail, we came up with a clarification of the CSM significance test process that we apply in our project with some quite good feedback so far. So I guess we're now opening to your questions.
Indeed. I'll post this particular question that came up from the last webinar. Question? Hang on. What can we do to help people interpret the significance test well, as ultimately it's quite subjective? But if something is incorrectly judged as not significant, then the opportunity for rigor of the CSMRA is missed. Ivan, would you like to take that first?
Well, I'm happy to do that, Colin, if you don't mind. So, as I said, in Network Rail, the observation was that quite a few projects actually struggled to go through applying the significance test as defined in legislation. And again, I don't think there is anything particularly wrong with legislation. And I did mention this last time, what is missing in my mind is a bit on how to do things. So in Network Rail, we developed this CSM test that we apply. After this, I will copy and provide the link to something we call System Integration Hub, where this process is outlined. And as I said, we have a really good feedback from people who use it. But basically, it's based on coming up with a simple system definition of what is the change that project is supposed to introduce to the railway as a system, and then systematically going through all of the interfaces, looking at the change and applying the test on it. Initially, when we explained to people what we hope and want them to do, there was a bit of a pushback because, again, it was seen as, oh God, not another workshop-like exercise. It's going to take us a lot of time, etc. But after they tried it, usually the project of an average size and complexity can do it within about half a day with some preparation to do, as I said, a little simple system definition prior to it, and then run the exercise through that. This also, following this systematic, almost templated approach allows us to now have templated, ready-made bits for projects of similar scope. So one of the things we have introduced and we are rolling out is a station, walks on the station and changing the stations or building a new station, generic system definition, generic hazard log, hazard record, generic CSM assessment, which we review for each project, but we reuse the material from before, so we don't start from scratch. And again, it's greatly accelerated the effort as well as improved the quality and it's been assessed by AsBo, NCB, Network Rail Certification Body. And I believe now they have finally signed it off, or they're about to sign it off, but we have already run quite a few projects through that and went through the panels for approval with quite success.
Is it worth just adding, though, that Network Rail's requirement is that even if your project is not significant, you still have to follow the CSM process? So whilst you don't have to appoint an AsBo, you still got to follow the process. So you still get that opportunity to apply the rigour that CSM offers.
Good. Jugan, could I perhaps ask your view on that? Ivan, do you want to just switch off your audio and video?
Yeah.
I like what Ivan explained, because he explained that they have built in Network Rail their reference system, exactly what Carolyn explained during the presentation of the AsBo, and then they reuse their internal risk control measures, and they evaluate the gaps between every new case, application, station. Are there differences which would require something else to be new risk control measures, and then updating the database. So, but to come back to the initial question, what we do have people will come back to it at the end, but I would just like to stress that you have to keep in mind, what do you want to reach with the assessment of the significance? So is your objective to say that the change is not significant and then to do nothing? Or is your objective, I want to control all risks, and it's only if I'm convinced that there are areas where I would need the support of the assessment body, and then I will look for additional reasons why I would need to do more than just controlling the risks I was used to do. So regardless, and this is something that Colin mentioned, you will receive written answers to questions. Regardless the change is significant or not, you must identify all potential risks which can be generated by the modification, by the change, and you must control them. And usually this is something that you do during the assessment of the significance of the change. You make a preliminary risk assessment, which will give you visibility. Okay, I need additional support, someone who is going to challenge me, and then I will appoint an AsBo. Or with what I have in the preliminary risk assessment will be a sufficient inventory of risks and risk control measures so that I am happy with that. So this is what I would say to complement just what Ivan said.
Okay, thanks, Jugan. We have another question similarly on a similar theme, and maybe I could invite Pete to just comment on well, what do we do in relation to documentation where a change is deemed to be non-significant?
If you deem a change to be non-significant, recording your justification for that decision. As we said in the previous webinar, and as has been mentioned a few times, because something is non-significant, it does not mean do nothing. You still have to manage risk. You still have to produce a safe solution. You still have to implement a safe system. The only thing that you are relieved from doing, if you determine that your change is non-significant, is getting a third-party assessment body to assess your application of the CSM process. So you've still got to manage, as we've already discussed. It would seem sensible to use the process that CSMRA provides for us for our non-significant changes, just as we would for our significant changes. The only difference being we're not assessed by that assessment body.
Carolyn, from an assessment body point of view, does it? I guess there's no role for the assessment body in, as Pete has just mentioned, on this sort of review of this significant, non-significant thing to say whether you believe it should have been significant or not.
No, and in fact, the regulation specifically excludes us from looking at the significance decision.
Right.
So we don't look at it.
Okay. Thank you. Ivan, did you want to say something? Ivan? Yep.
I wanted to add about something. It's all about scalability. So, in my mind, and I said that's what we are rolling out in Network Rail. If a project is non-significant, yes, of course, you have to manage all of the safety risks regardless. But what it means is that, for example, your engineering safety management plan should be much thinner and more focused on how you're going to demonstrate assurance against standards, good practice, etc., as opposed to how you're going to do quantified risk assessments, etc. Your hazard record should be equally well structured and well populated, but most of the hazards will be managed through compliance with existing standards and requirements, and the evidence will be some B&B and testing reports, etc. So again, what we did through producing a guidance on how to apply the CSM test, we have managed including to that guidance on a scale and focus of the effort regarding documentation or analysis and assessments for significant and not significant projects. Yeah, that's it for me.
If I can complement to what Ivan just said concerning the hazard log and populating the hazard log, Carolyn also explained it during her presentation. I had the opportunity in the last years to look at the hazard logs of a few proposals across Europe. And I have to say that what I have seen is just a copy-paste of the HAZOP or FMEA table, and they call it a hazard log, which then indeed includes much more information than needed for an easy hazard log management. So this is something both Caroline and Ivan insisted to populate the hazard log with the right information, with the right granularity. And in the example of code of practice reference systems, everything doesn't need to be in the hazard log for the management. You can have extra documentation which proves that you have gone through every step of the code of practice, so that you control all the hazards through the hazards covered by that code, by the code of practice. So be careful. Hazard log is not a copy paste of FME or HAZOP table.
Okay, thank you. I think that that covers the questions we had on significant changes. We can obviously come back to that under the general section if there are further changes to be had. What I would like to do now is move on to the second section covering risk acceptance principles and determining risk acceptability. And if I could invite Pete just to say a few words on that before we get into the, we have a few questions on this.
So we discussed this at the previous seminar as well. And if you remember in Dragan's presentation on at the beginning of the previous seminar, I talked about the introduction of the risk acceptance principles and the fact that that this gave us a route to a means of analysing and evaluating our risks, bringing in our codes of practice and similar reference systems, as well as explicit risk estimation, as one would have expected in classic risk analysis. What we've got to make sure is that that our code of practice or our similar reference system are appropriate to our change under assessment, and that at the end of it, that we've actually applied something that does get us to the point where our risk evaluation concludes that we have achieved broadly acceptable. So blindly applying a code of practice, a standard, an industry code of practice won't necessarily work. You might hit it lucky, but what you're looking for is an assessment of the applicability. A lot of codes of practice and standards are written in specific circumstances. They're generated from specific historical events or incidents, and therefore we need to ensure that what we're applying it to is appropriate to its domain and its application. And the same with the reference system. Similarity has to be appropriate in order to allow the read across of safety conclusions from one system to another. But where that is appropriate, that will give us an easier route to achieving our risk evaluation and acceptance. Right, on to the questions.
A question from Oscar here. If a deviation from the code of practice to control a hazard occurs, can the deviation be covered by another code of practice, or should a reference system or explicit risk estimation be used instead? Pete, would you like to take that first?
We've got a deviation from. Yes, I suppose you could cover the deviation by another code of practice, or you could cover it by a reference system. What you've got to look at is where have you got to? What have you achieved in your risk evaluation? Have you achieved broadly acceptable? Do you need to go further? Is the deviation appropriate? And is the deviation achieving a better level of safety, or is it taking us in the wrong direction? If that's the case, then maybe we're not applying the right code of practice, and maybe we need to approach the risk acceptance from a different angle.
Okay, thank you. Dragan, would you like to say anything on this one?
I noticed that there was a sound problem during switching, muting the micro.
Yeah, you're okay at the moment.
No, I think that what Pete explained is correct. The three principles in the CSM, usually on complex projects, they will all be used. And when indeed you notice that you cannot fully control the hazard with one of the principles, that means that the hazard level, the level of identification of the hazard is not pushed enough deep. If you need several principles or risk control measures, that means that you need to go further in the hazard analysis. And yes, when you see that one of the principles is not controlling enough the hazard, that means you can use other principles, one of the two other principles, no problem.
Okay, thank you. Ivan or Carolyn, would you like to say anything on this one?
That what's been said before, I agree with. You know, it's up to you how you manage your hazard, but you just need to select a set of codes of practice, reference systems, or conduct explicit risk estimation to make sure you fully mitigate the hazard. So it's combining, always, it's not one or other, it's always combining these things, the risk acceptance principles.
I would expect every railway company to have a process in place for deviation from a standard or derogation from a standard. You should just follow the process, and if the process allows for relating it to another code of practice, then fine. If not, you'll have to do whatever the process requires. But basically and essentially, it is all about doing the risk assessment. Anyway.
Okay, thank you. And just sort of following on, I think there's the question that came up in the last webinar is about the view on using a risk matrix approach under the CSM, and whether that's suitable, and also whether the hazards fall within the tolerable range of or alert region are often open for interpretation. Will the ERA or RSSB look to publish further guidance to help with better quantification to ensure consistent approach across the industry? If Dragan is able to comment on that one, perhaps. Dragana, are you there? If not, Pete, from the ORR perspective.
Bragan speaking. If I'm not wrong, in the answer I have proposed in the questionnaire is that I have seen both addition and multiplication for the risk priority numbers in order to determine how to prioritize the risk management efforts and so on. But what is important is that when you have selected one way of doing, you have to apply the same way of categorizing the risks. So you cannot, otherwise you will assign wrong priority. So if you have decided to sum up the criteria, all hazards summing up. If you have decided to multiply. Concerning the hazard and the alarm area, in the CSM, I have to say that we were not able to harmonize and to introduce the concept of alarm explicitly, but it's a good sense if at a low price you can add a risk control measure which will decrease either the severity or the frequency or both. It's reasonable to do it and not to stop leaving the point in the matrix where it is. So I encourage to do that if it is possible at a low cost.
I would say, though, Dragan, that from a logarithmic scale, the only mathematically correct way of doing it is to add them. As a, if you're using logarithmic scales for the risk matrix, but we probably shouldn't get into the details of the maths for this particular occasion. Pete, would you like to say anything on ORR's view on risk matrix?
I have to say, at a simple level, whichever you decide to apply, you need to be able to justify your decision, and you need to be consistent in the way that you apply it.
Yeah, sure.
What are you trying to achieve at the end? You're trying to achieve all hazards managed to an acceptable level. Therefore, whatever method you choose to rank them, you still got to deal with them all. And when dealing, the question mentions tolerable range. If something is tolerable, it still means that there is more that could be done. Therefore, you need to prove that it is unreasonable to do more, not just stop because that's as far as you've got.
Okay, thank you. I've got another question while you're on, Pete, about explicit risk estimation. Is it always needed to assess the probability and severity in the way that EN 50126 does, for instance, or measures determined in the analysis are sufficient to consider the hazard control, provided that they avoid the hazard in all circumstances? So I guess that's saying it's bordering onto the broadly acceptable, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, do you have to go to the... No, you don't. But you have to be able to justify what you've done. So can you justify that you have achieved a tolerable level, that you have managed the hazard? If you've avoided the hazard, great, even better.
And I guess making qualitative arguments are also valid.
Oh yeah, we often make qualitative arguments.
Yeah,
I wouldn't use them where something was, close to the line, if you see what I mean.
Ivan, do you have any thoughts on this one?
Pete, the only thing I would like to add is about this risk matrices. Now, I'm quite emotional about them, and I hate them because I don't see any science in them at all. And I think the only thing they should be used for is to really prioritize your work in a hazard record. If you actually read some of the standards and guidance, you're supposed to scale them to your project. I've not yet met a person who managed to explain to me how to do it. So as I said, in my mind, to be honest, actually it doesn't really matter. Do you add or multiply? I agree with Colin. Adding is probably the correct way mathematically to do that. But I don't see any science behind them. I think they should only be used for prioritization. In no way they could be used to justify decision making. Decision making is what Pete explained and Carolyn before that, really about demonstrating that there is nothing else you can do for reasonable effort to make it safer, and it is already safe enough.
Okay, thank you. Carolyn, were you going to say something?
Itself is not prescriptive in terms of what we need to do, so we don't have to follow a risk matrix at all. We are at liberty to choose a process for doing explicit risk estimation which is suitable for the change that we're making or the risk that we're assessing. So CSM is intentionally not prescriptive in terms of the approach we take for doing explicit risk estimation.
Okay. Correct, Carolyn. And I would again emphasize what Pete said just now, that explicit risk estimation can also be qualitative. So I have seen often some NSAs automatically considering that explicit risk estimation means quantification, absolutely. And same for some assessment bodies. So no, it can also be qualitative. So based on expert judgment.
Okay, just one final question before we move on. This was a question that came from Etienne. Who can refuse one risk assessment analysis and on what basis? I mean, I think this probably comes in to thinking about from the AsBo role as to whether there's a way of whether in what case would a risk assessment methodology be turned down from a assessment body point of view. Carolyn, was that something you could comment on?
Yeah, I mean, as I just said, CSM is not prescriptive, so you are entitled to choose a methodology that analyses your risk, and whether that be, as already stated, it can be qualitative, it can be quantitative. So I think it would be quite difficult for the AsBo to state that a process is inappropriate. If you've got a lot of novelty and uncertainty, you might want to do a bit more analysis to look at detailed behaviours of your system, and a very qualitative approach might not be appropriate in some circumstances. But it's up to you to decide what's appropriate, and it's up to you to come up with an argument that you can substantiate. So if you can't substantiate the argument, then you need to think about a different way of going about it, but it is entirely up to you. It is worth noting that if a risk assessment has been undertaken on, say you're using the reference system, and there's been a risk assessment on that reference system, and that has been subject to an assessment body review, and that AsBo has accepted it, then another assessment body shouldn't come along and question that analysis. They should accept the results of the analysis. They obviously could ask to see the results and check that it's in line with, say, the application of the reference system. So they'd need to check that the analysis is still valid. But in terms of what the AsBo's looked at and the AsBo signing off, that's the whole point of having us all accredited. So we can't then reject an analysis that another AsBo has accepted.
Colin, if Etienne's question was related indeed to the AsBo opinion, no, the proposer is the final one in the CSM who decides to go forward with the change based, of course, on the inputs from the assessment body. Nevertheless, so it's permitted by the CSM, and if the proposer does not agree with the assessment body, he has to justify to get it auditable by the National Safety Authority. Nevertheless, I was going to say what Carolyn explained in her presentation. If the assessment body is involved from the beginning of the project, following the change management and the risk assessment on complex projects, then it is likely that all problems would be discovered on time by the AsBo, where action plans would be submitted by the proposer, and all the potential issues, problems will be solved before arriving at the end. So in my former experience, I have worked a lot with independent safety assessors. We never, at the end of the project, arrived at such a situation where the client of the AsBo, of the ISA, was not agreeing with the independent safety assessor. So the best risk control measure not to be in such a situation to disagree is to involve the assessment body at the beginning. Now what can happen is, if there is a disagreement between an AsBo and the proposer, is that in the scope, and especially in the case of fixed installations, when the National Safety Authority has to give an authorization for placing in service a line, the applicant, the infrastructure manager, has to have in place a proper justification why, despite the disagreement with the AsBo, according to him, the risk is controlled to an acceptable level. And then we come to what Carolyn explained. There is an argumentation why the IM, in the example I took, the infrastructure manager, estimates that the risk is controlled to an appropriate level, and so that he can use the project with that change. Thanks.
Moving into the section of the Q&A on assessment bodies, so I will continue with that theme now from a question from Honglian. Honglian agrees that the AsBo is a friend and partner on the project. However, having observed that certain AsBos have undertaken independent assessments as if they're the client and have included preferential requirements or have lacked respect to the project organisers, proposers processes, hence the process to independence should be better defined. Is that something that you've recognised, Carolyn?
Well, I hope not, really, because I hope that's not the way I go about it. There is guidance. If you look on the European Rail Agency website, there is guidance about the approach an assessment body should take. We have to be independent, so we shouldn't be forcing you down a certain route. We could suggest that the route that you've adopted is not necessarily the best route for you, but if the route that you adopt is sufficiently robust that it's going to end up with you being able to argue that your system is safe, if it's not the most efficient route, say, that doesn't matter. You're at liberty to choose what route you want to take. So a good example is whether you use explicit risk estimation instead of, say, using a code of practice when there is a code of practice that's available. That's not wrong. You can do that. It's not the best use of CSM. It's not the best use of your time. If there's a code of practice that already exists, we should use it. But if you want to go down an explicit risk estimation route and go back to first principles and reanalyze everything again, that you can do that, as long as you end up with an argument that you can substantiate. So I don't believe that an AsBo should be adopting that approach at all. We should not be saying that you must take a certain route to get to an argument that your system is safe.
Okay, thanks. Pete, being working on both sides of the fence with this one, is there something that you can comment on for this particular question?
It's certainly, I alluded to it in the last webinar, that I have come across this, and I took it up with the professional head of the AsBo when an assessor was basically trying to preferentially re-engineer my project because it's outside their remit. And to me, it's an inappropriate application of their role.
Something on this one?
Yes, I came across this a couple of times, and I have to say I was never AsBo myself. And I also have to say I worked with some really great AsBos, but I came across this as well. In my view, I don't think that we can actually do anything with defining the process any better. It's already well defined. It's really to do with, again, in my view, it's two things: the behaviors and the competencies of people on both sides, the AsBo as well as the project. And you know what? Competition is a great thing. So we have raised issues like this before, that AsBos in questions, they're improving, and these things are changing. But on the end of the day, you always have a choice of another AsBo if it doesn't work with that. I'm not saying by any means AsBo should do just tap on the shoulder and say a project is great, but this kind of behavior is not acceptable. It's not what they should be doing, and it's costing the industry lots of time and money and effort, and most of all, it's actually counterproductive to safety.
Okay, thank you. While you're on, we have a question from Reese here, which sort of touches on a point that was made at the last webinar. Do the panel think that an AsBo should consider proposers' application of CDM, that's the Construction Design and Management Regulation assessments, during their assessment? For example, should a designer's risk assessment be reviewed to understand the operational hazards and their applicability to the CSMRA?
Well, so I did mention this before. There is an overlap between what the CDM regulation covers and what I refer to the system safety of CSM covers. And the overlap is the area about making sure that once the project is finished, what is installed and put into use can be safely maintained and operated. Everything to do with that should be covered by CSM, and AsBo should be looking at that. The CDM also covers the safety during construction work or during implementation works, health and safety on site, etc. In my mind, it's nothing to do with AsBo's remit, and AsBo should not be considering that at all.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, the regulation is the common safety method is about the final state of the railway and the operation and maintenance of a safe railway, and not about the construction side. So what Ivan said, absolutely, whatever's residual risk after the construction is part of CSM. And so we would focus on that. We would not focus on CDM.
Okay, thank you. Could I ask maybe Dragan to comment on this one? Changes that are non-significant that will be authorised, is it necessary to have an AsBo? For non-significant changes, understood that safe integration is also verified, and according to the Directive 2016/797, the file must include an AsBo assessment report. Can you just unmute, Dragan? Are you there? Oh. Carolyn, is this one that you would have a view on?
Do you hear me?
Yeah, I do now, yep.
I was on mute, it was strange. I'm not sure to understand to which part it relates to. Specifically concerning safe integration, and I think it well insisted on it. Safe integration is not something which is dependent on significant or not significant, and it must always be there, and all risks need to be controlled. So when we incorporate a part of a changed subsystem into a broader system, we need to cover the safe integration. So if the change was classified non-significant, yes, then the implication, no obligation to have an AsBo. What I would like to clarify concerning vehicles, there is a separate piece of legislation. It's Regulation 2018-545, which says that whenever a vehicle requires an authorization for placing on the market, then there shall systematically be risk assessment according to Annex 1 of the CSM, and there shall be an assessment body report. So for vehicles with authorization is clear. Here I do not understand fully the context. If it is for the infrastructure part, with also integration of ETCS on the infrastructure, I would say that in the CCS-TSI, it's very technical, but in the CCS-TSI, there is a differentiation if a change is managed by a railway undertaking or an infrastructure manager for deploying the ERTMS, the control command on the infrastructure, or whether it is subcontracted to a manufacturer. But I would say that by analogy, the risks do not differ in terms of implementation of ETCS on the infrastructure in function of whether it's done by the infrastructure manager or by a manufacturer. So in that case, I would say that it is likely that the infrastructure manager should classify such a change of infrastructure as significant, and there shall be an assessment body report. And this wouldn't then be an obstacle to the authorization by the National Safety Authority of that piece of infrastructure fitted with CCS. But it's quite technical, and we need to enter into the CCS-TSI if it was the meaning of that question from Patricia.
Yeah. Pete, do you have this is kind of your area, is that something that you could comment on?
I was going to come on then.
You're back, you're on.
Right, okay. This is the interesting area of authorization on significant changes. Well, you've still got to, I mean, to my mind, you've still got to prove safe integration, and one of the easy ways of proving safe integration is to engage an AsBo. Just because you've determined yourself to be non-significant doesn't mean that you can't voluntarily say, I'll engage an AsBo, so why not?
But you don't have to do it. It's not mandatory.
You could find another way of justifying safe integration. I'm just wondering which way you would choose, and it might be easier just to go
the standard route. Yeah.
I've got a NOBO unapproved body involved.
Sure.
So why don't I get an AsBo involved?
Yeah.
Thanks, Pete. If I understand, you defend the same position as me. Indeed, the CSM for risk assessment does not make compulsory the appointment of an AsBo for non-significant changes, which we have said so many times that they also need to be properly managed. But there are no provisions in the CSM which forbid the appointment on a voluntary basis by the proposer of an AsBo to follow also non-significant change management. So I fully encourage what you said. Why couldn't it be an AsBo? No reason for that. It could well be an AsBo. So there is no interdiction. It's not forbidden in the CSM to appoint an AsBo also for that.
Okay, thank you for covering that one. I've got a question for Carolyn here from Bernd. Is it needed for AsBo to look very deeply into the hazard record, and if so, how detailed? This is certainly an area where my experience is very difficult to keep out of the detail, but maybe current views on that.
I think we should. I mean, the hazard record is obviously the key central repository in CSM that you use to identify those hazards, their safety requirements, and provide the evidence that you've met the safety requirements. So the hazard record is absolutely a crucial part of complying with the process. And because we don't just look at the process, we look at the results of the process, we will very much look into the detail of the hazard record. And so we would look at whether we thought you'd identified all of your hazards and documented them. We would look at whether you've identified the right set of safety requirements to mitigate those hazards. And we will look at making sure that you've either provided evidence that you've met the safety requirements or that you've transferred them to someone else to take ownership and implement safety requirements. So yes, we do look very detailed into the hazard record. As I said in my presentation, it's not a 100% review. We don't look at every single hazard, and we don't look at every single safety requirement. We will do a selective review of the document. We'll focus on complicated ones, but we'll also select some of the more simpler ones, even things like hazards that you've determined are broadly acceptable. We'll check arguments for broad acceptability, just to make sure that we're not dismissing hazards too readily and therefore not giving them the scrutiny that they deserve. So yes, we should do a detailed review, but it's a selective detailed review of parts of the hazard record.
Okay, thank you. Ivan, is this an area, something you'd like to comment on?
Right, so my answer is yes, but I believe the depth of check that AsBos or ISAs or ISHPAs are doing when they do their independent reviews is directly proportionate to confidence in the project team. So as I said, I was never AsBo or ISA or ISHPA, but in my previous role in London Underground, I used to review quite a lot of submissions to London Underground. And if I was confident in the project team, I would do a spot check. And if it comes out as a clean, then I would probably stop. If it comes out as wrong, I would go deeper and deeper and deeper, because I would simply not trust the project in doing, because it would be evidenced through what they're doing. There is another side of the coin as well. Here that I've actually had a few AsBos saying that this is the project of this size, I expect you to have a certain number of hundreds of hazard records in your hazard records, or would ask questions about why certain hazards are missing. They expect to see them without previously actually looking at the system definition and understanding that these interfaces are not impacted as well. So as I said, the both sides need to work collectively, and I think the best way to resolve this and to make sure it actually is successful at the end is to start early, work with AsBo, be honest and open about the project, and move collectively together. And as well in Crossrail, we've actually put on our website, SRP is your best mate. If you need help, come to SRP and ask for help, or go to your AsBo and ask them for their opinion and view.
Okay, thank you. Just moving on to another question that came up as part of Carolyn's presentation, noting about the differences between an independent safety assessment and an AsBo.
Yeah.
Do they focus on different things, or are they fundamentally the same?
The process they're following, carrying out an independent assessment of a safety management system, is fundamentally the same, but just as an AsBo will undertake a different assessment for a different project, it's true that there is a difference to the domain knowledge you need, depending on the complexity, the depth you might go to in terms of doing your analysis. The question there says there's a project with at least both. You don't need to have both an ISA and an AsBo. An AsBo can undertake the role of the ISA, but provided they are competent to do that. So they need to be they need to have domain knowledge in the CEng standards. You can't do a check for compliance with CEng standards if you're not familiar with the CEng standards. So it may be appropriate to appoint a different body to check for compliance of a CEng standard. So for example, you can have a project where the product is being developed in accordance with the CEng standards, and they're developing a generic product. So you might want to appoint a body there that's competent in the CEng standards to do the check for the generic product. When it comes to, say, Network Rail installing that product, they're making a change to the railway, they need to follow a process for installing that product. They may then choose to follow a CSM process. And then obviously they need to appoint an AsBo. So there could be circumstances where you have different bodies doing each role, because there's different parts of the project that you need to be focusing on. One is generic development, one is specific application. But equally, they can be the same organisation. And just like they would assess different parts of a project, different parts of a system, they would do an assessment of the generic development, and they would do an assessment of the specific application. So there's a difference only because it's a different part of the project, not because the ISA or the AsBo is a different entity.
Okay, thanks.
Okay.
I fully agree, Dragan, speaking with Carolyn explained, indeed. And you can well have in the example of the question, different AsBos, one doing what is said, ISA, by one AsBo who has the competence for that area, and the AsBo doing an AsBo at a higher level for high-level assessments. And typically, the example that you gave, Carolyn, is good. The CCS competence and 5128, for example, for the software assessment, compliance to the code of practice, which is the software in the CCS TSI. It's a completely different competence, technical knowledge competence of the AsBo compared to a big and complex infrastructure project where the AsBo needs to have a higher knowledge of all the different pieces, components of the system, how they interrelate together. And then it will reuse the outputs of the AsBo for the CCS who would work on the trackside part. So definitely just to draw the line in European legislation now, the ISA doesn't exist anymore. So when we mention CEng in European legislation, and where CEng says it shall be done by an ISA, this European legislation says that the ISA has to be replaced by a competent AsBo. So an AsBo who has the right accreditation for that competence. So this should in future disappear. And just between brackets, many ISAs have moved and are accredited AsBos as well. So they can act as ISA or AsBo depending on the contracts they have in the industry.
Okay, thank you. Pete, are you there? Have you got your microphone available? Yeah. Are you there but not coming through, perhaps? Move on to a another question to do with assessment bodies. In my this is a question from Henrik. In my AsBo jobs, I find that proposers struggle with providing proper arguments for compliance with CSMRA under Annex 1. The code of practices must be relevant to the control of the considered hazards in the system under assessment. Any comments or views of the panel members, please? Ivan, as you're on, Pete's obviously struggling to speak at the moment.
I've actually, well, I hope you can hear me now, but I've seen the same as Henrik, that occasionally when working as an AsBo, clients did struggle to be able to justify why they'd picked a particular code of practice for a particular hazard. So yeah, you're not alone.
I would agree as well. Now, to be honest, it should be a very simple thing to resolve. Just per couple of lines of justification why you picked up that code of practice, why I believe that code of practice is applicable in a hazard record. It doesn't necessarily mean that you need to go and identify specific clauses and sub-clauses in the code of practice at all. That's another thing I don't necessarily agree with some of the AsBos. But a justification on why that particular code of practice is applicable should be there.
Yeah, it is related to the CSM. The CSM, we have an equivalent for code of practice and reference systems, and I think Pete insisted well today that when you select a measure, you have to demonstrate that the use, you have to be sure that the use of that risk control measure, and in this slide of a code of practice, is relevant for your specific case. And this is something indeed which is where the assessment body is entitled to request, do you have why this code of practice is relevant, and can indeed read parts of the code of practice to get the assurance that indeed is appropriate for that specific situation. Otherwise, this was one of the weak points that I summarized last time, that in order to avoid explicit risk estimation, the sector tries to use wrongly codes of practice and reference systems without checking necessarily the relevance. So yes, it's part of both the applicant proposer task to verify the applicability, and the AsBo can decide to check that as well, depending on what Carolyn explained, the sample checking and vertical slice assessment, if they fall on that hazard and that code of practice, they can indeed do it.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to, I'm sort of moving more into a sort of general questions section now, because we did cover documentation in quite a bit of detail. I'm going to just go to a question from Stephen, which is an interesting one, going back to the point that it's always the proposer that accepts the results of the CSM, but Stephen makes the point the proposer is not always the same as the duty holder. If the duty holder sides with the AsBo, surely the duty holder is able to stop the implementation of the change, irrespective of the proposer, I guess. Pete,
And
is that something?
Right thing.
Sorry, say again?
I said, and surely that is the right thing. If the duty holder is not happy, and they are the duty holder, then surely they have the ability to, and quite rightly so, to frustrate the implementation of the change. The proposer should be working with the duty holder, and therefore this should not happen, but it does. And in the end, it is the duty holder who has to operate and safely operate the system after the change has been made. So therefore, they need to be fully involved.
This is a very good question, where we usually see indeed risks not well managed, where a financial consortium purchases vehicles or a region builds a piece of railway line, and at the end they give the vehicles for operation to railway undertaking or traffic management to an infrastructure manager. And what Pete explained is that those financial or political initiatives, they shall cooperate with the final user of the piece of equipment, vehicle or railway line, so that the right actors who have the knowledge to manage properly the project team and also the AsBo, that they are already involved. And this is part of, maybe I did not insist, part of the coordination that I explained with splitting the former railways into new actors. This is also another case where the cooperation is more than necessary between the duty holder, the one who will operate, and the project team, rather than just those who are having the money. And this risk is emphasized in the paper ERA drafted on the safe integration concept. These are really areas of greatest risks.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to go on to this question from Reese. Use of reference systems as a risk acceptance principle is very low in my experience of UK projects. Does the panel think there is a basis for low usage? Are the CSMRA point 2.4.2 requirements too prohibitive or misunderstood? Ivan, have you got a view on that one?
I agree. Don't see these very often. To be honest, I think it's to do a lot with two things. Misunderstanding is one thing, and the other one is actually sometimes it's really difficult to demonstrate that the reference system is the adequate reference system to be used for. So I think we should be using it much more for relatively simple repetitive projects, because this is where it really comes, in its place. I've seen quite a few times quite complex, especially signaling projects, trying to use reference systems between two different countries in Europe or even further afield, and it always ended up being probably more painful and more difficult than actually starting from scratch and building the safety argument from beginning. As I said, the main issue always is demonstrating it is really an appropriate reference system to be used. And the more complex the project is, the more interfaces involved, the more difficult it is to do.
Sure. I must, being involved in the original working groups on for the European Rail Agency in developing CSMRA, I must say I personally thought that this the risk acceptance principle would be used quite often, particularly as experience grew with the use of CSMRA. So it's interesting to hear that it's not being as widely used as we might have imagined.
The thing, sorry, Colin, to come back on it, but as I said, one of the things we're really trying to do in Network Rail in Eastern region, at least now, is quite a lot of our projects are to do with stations, either changing the stations or modifying the stations or building new stations. So we developed this a generic system definition, system hazard record, pre-populated with hazards and mitigations requirements, etc. And we want to reuse that. Now, in my mind, it is, a very good application of a reference system. You've got a station you did before, you got it through approvals. You can review what you did and demonstrate it's not different, or it's slightly different to what you did, and then you can reuse quite a lot of the stuff you did before. But as I said, in my mind, it really has limitations. If you're talking about complex safety critical control systems, signaling, SCADA, that kind of stuff, it's really not easy, because the national rules are different for start, the environment is often different, the frequency of trains, operational processes are different. You really need to go down to a level of detail that includes, what is the software version that is installed, what is the part number, is it exactly the same, etc. And it then really gets very complicated.
If I may complement, I share the same, that we thought that it was going to be largely used. Nevertheless, I am not surprised given the poor experience we have with the CSM, where the sector in the hurry, many changes are not significant. And where they are significant, they appoint assessment bodies at the end. So in the hurry of getting the things commissioned, the stakeholders, those less mature with the concept of risk management, they have a poor documentation management system and configuration management system in place. So because they have not well documented what they have done, it's difficult for them on next projects to reuse that documentation. And this question is just one reason more to encourage people doing what Ivan explained for the stations, to build their reference system so that they can benefit for the investments that they did on former projects, where they had the perception that they were exposed to higher costs, but then they will have less documentation to produce on next applications of the same type of projects. And typically what I know is that this concept of reference system is more used for vehicles where new vehicles are usually based on existing platforms, on existing vehicles. So the concept of having in place a well-managed system of registers, databases, checklists, and so on, enables to benefit from earlier investments in well tracing what they have done, so to be capable to reuse as reference system for new projects. So this is probably an explanation why it's not used as much as we expected initially. But I expect it in future, especially with the pressure we have through this vehicle authorization regulation 2018-545, that there is a kind of reflex development of that culture in building the right documentation, so that in future they can benefit from the acquis.
Okay, thank you very much, Dragan. I think, conscious of the time, I wondered if we could just have that as our last question and just ask Carolyn and perhaps Peter the final thought. Any thoughts on this particular point on use of reference systems?
Yeah, I mean, I think what Dragan was saying there, that and well, Anna, Ivan, if we invest our time well now in applying CSM, and it might take a little bit more time on those first projects, we end up with, particularly on the more business as usual projects, we should end up with applications which have got good evidence of CSM, that we will be able to use those as reference systems going forward. And I think that's quite key, that we should see this initial investment in CSM in the long term to allow us to really reap the benefits of a good first application of CSM. So instead of saying, oh, it's too hard now and not engaging, if we can get it right now, which might take a little bit more time, I think we'll really see the benefits, and
Sure.
particularly, for example, use of reference systems going forwards.
Okay, thank you. Pete, final thought?
Yeah, quite agree. The reference system approaches, it really should pay dividends. You invest up front, you bank the evidence, and you reuse it. It's got to be an efficient way of doing business.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that final thought, and thanks very much for the panel for going through all those questions. There are still one or two questions that are unanswered, as is always the case, and we will add those to the list of the ones that the team are preparing answers to, and they will come out to you shortly, and hopefully that'll complete the responses to those questions. It's been an excellent session. I'd now like to invite Dragan to come back online again to give his final thoughts as we sum up this session.
Okay. Do you hear me, Colin? Yes. No.
Good. Ivan, do you want to go on to mute?
So, what are the next steps? I lowered the size of my screen, sorry, unintentionally. I would say that now the hot potato is on the field of the European Railway Agency in collaboration with the national safety authorities, where, based on what we have explained last time and the questions we still continue, you are not the exceptions to raise the questions, be reassured that we shall collaborate with the national authorities to develop a right dissemination program on training the sector in their native languages. This is very important in order to improve the awareness, and I have said that earlier, on risk management concepts, including the proactive risk assessment and continual monitoring, and the need to build the safety culture I mentioned, including the identification and control of hazards linked to the variability of human performance and human and organizational factors in all steps, raising awareness, what Pete said last time, education, education, education. Then we should repeat that and leave time to the sector gaining progressively experience, learning by doing and improving on the lessons learned. What we recommended, and I would repeat it again, is to avoid creating additional burden and confusion in the sector mind with unnecessary revision of risk assessment or risk monitoring legislation. Indeed, before revising it, it is good to have, it is better to build a solid return of experience with the objective justifications why we need improvements and clarifications in guidance material. Also, as said last time, the European Commission, the agency, but also in partnership with the member states, we should take strategic decisions and undertake initiatives in terms of program for engineering and education and training in order, on one hand, to compensate what we observe today, a lack of expertise on the market in railway risk assessments, and also, on the other hand, to anticipate the growing erosion or loss of railway expertise with the continually increasing number of people, railway employees, reaching the age of retirement. So, concerning the sector perception of what we already discussed, the added value when using the assessment bodies, in order to ensure, we need to ensure via a better coordination with the assessment bodies, and you know we have this cooperation of the assessment bodies, cooperation group, but also a better cooperation with the national accreditation bodies and the recognition bodies to improve the acknowledgement of the competence of the assessment bodies, and also of during the supervision activities, to improve also the working methods of the assessment body. So the assessment body, as we explained, is a friend who has to have also technical knowledge, and it cannot only be box ticking. So in order to have this added value. And finally, in coordination with ERA, national safety authorities, European cooperation for accreditation, what we need to do at European level is to monitor the effectiveness of all the control mechanisms which are foreseen in the legislation, to see where are the problems in order to better target the areas for further improvement of the activities on one side of ERA, of course, of national safety authorities, for example, in supervising the compliance with the legislation, supporting ERA. European Cooperation for Accreditation, which is the overarching organism entity which monitors the performance of the national accreditation bodies involved in the accreditation of assessment bodies and notified bodies. Also coordination or improvement of the recognition of the assessment bodies, improving NOBOs, ASBOs, DSBO activities, but also the activities of entities in charge of maintenance, their certification bodies, and finally, to improve the application of the methodologies by railway undertakings, infrastructure managers, and the entities in charge of maintenance. So the hot potato now is, as I said, on our hands, and this is something we are looking at in ERA, how to put that in place. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Jugan, for summarising that, and thanks again for to all the panel members, Ivan, Carolyn, Pete, and Jugan, for going through all those questions, giving their very valuable time to talk about all these subjects in a great deal of detail. I will just close up the session now. Normally, SARS webinars are available as just as a member benefit. As I said at the start, this particular webinar is going to be made publicly available, and I will send a link to it. I will send link to it in a little while. So just to summarize up. Finally, I'm going to initiate a feedback form. Please can I ask you to fill it in before you exit the webinar. The information is really important to us, and indeed it was the feedback from the last webinar that prompted us to put on this particular session. It'll only take a couple of minutes to fill in. Please do so and click submit. We didn't have CPD certificate. Honestly, we did. No, you can. I will send you a further CPD certificate for this if you requested one at the original registration. All I can do now is to say thank you all for attending very much, and thank you again to our speakers for giving up their time and energy to support this particular webinar. And please, in these difficult times, stay safe.